Hi everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today I'll be presenting some research from my postdoc project, which is to do with corporate reputation and political access in the United Kingdom at Westminster and Holyrood. My PI on this project is Kollman and the co-I is Alvise Favotto. So to begin with, just a quick overview of the project. We look at the relationship between corporate social responsibility credentials and lobbying access for a sample of FTSE 350 firms over a period of about 10 years. These firms appeared at 3 different venues, so we look at Holyrood committees, Westminster committees, and business, energy and industrial strategy, ministerial meetings and hospitality sessions. At the moment, unfortunately, we still have some data collection to do, but we have quite provisional findings that suggest there is a relationship at Westminster, as well as some kind of bivariate stuff that also suggests that. Unfortunately, we still have some way to go with that, but that's one area that we'll be looking for feedback. So you might be wondering at this stage what corporate social responsibility actually means. The understanding among scholars and activists and policymakers has rapidly evolved since the 90s, creating quite a lot of pressure on firms. It started as kind of charitable initiatives and has evolved to encompass generally 3 pillars: environmental, social and governance, which covers a whole range of different activities. In some quarters it's kind of viewed as a substitute for formal regulation, and this is true in some ways in that it fills gaps in state action and provision, especially as it becomes more difficult to regulate these large firms. There's been quite high uptake among transnational corporations of voluntary initiatives, including the UN Global Compact, and that's led to some concern about so-called CSR-washing among researchers and policymakers. This is the idea that basically companies are hiding behind all this kind of cheap talk on CSR to push a more self-interested or sinister agenda behind the scenes. So what we're interested in is the kind of under-researched lobbying angle. How does CSR credentials kind of affect the way that firms lobby? Now, unfortunately, there's not a huge amount of literature on this topic, presumably because of the difficulties involved in collecting data. There are some indications that CSR washing is fairly rare, but again, it's not something that's been tested all that often. There's a disconnect as well between corporate social responsibility and corporate political activity. They're often implemented completely separately within firms and are not coordinated. They don't speak to each other, which also kind of stokes fears and causes problems for researchers trying to dig into this stuff. Now, for firms' CSR credentials to matter to policy in the end, policymakers have to at first be aware of CSR credentials, and then act upon them when they're kind of looking at firms to invite or to make contact with to bring into the policymaking process. And there is some evidence from the United States that shows CSR credentials do help firms gain access to Congress. So here's an illustration of our research question in a kind of meme format. You have a firm that's adopted the UN Global Compact, but when you rip the mask off, is this really just a front for deregulation? That's the kind of concern in a nutshell, and that's what we are hoping to test here. And to state this in a more kind of academic way, the research question is: do firms' corporate social responsibility credentials facilitate their access to UK policymakers? So we're coming to this part of the project with 3 expectations. The main one is just the simple relationship that firms with stronger CSR credentials are more likely to gain access to UK policymakers. Just what Werner found in a UK context, basically. The second is that CSR credentials are more likely to affect access to legislative than executive venues. And this is because some scholars have shown that it's easier for companies to affect arenas with less kind of public scrutiny. So if they're a kind of badly behaved company, would expect them to find it less of a barrier to gain access to the executive, whereas we'd anticipate that legislators would reward better behaved companies. And finally, we expect that CSR credentials are more likely to affect access to the Scottish Parliament, and that's primarily because the Scottish Parliament was kind of set up to be more participative and more open to public scrutiny. The biggest part of this project was probably the data collection, which took a very, very long time. We collected information across 3 groups of venues: Westminster committees, including select and bill committees, UK government ministries, just business at the moment, formerly BIS, now BEIS, and Holyrood committees. Needless to say, it was quite a challenge because, at least for Westminster committees, there's no centralised database. All the information is compiled and published differently by each committee, and it came in a variety of different formats. So what we had to do is kind of collect all these formal minutes of meetings and just come up with a big list of all the companies that attended and then pick out the ones that we were looking for. For the ministries, there are more comprehensive kind of transparency publications. Although they can sometimes be consistent, they're also often spreadsheet form, which makes it a bit easier to kind of manipulate the information and match it up with the FTSE 350 database. And for Holyrood committees, it was quite easy. It was a centralised online database with a large collection of transcripts, all in HTML format, so it was a lot of copying and pasting, but it was done a lot quicker. So a quick note on the data structure: we use firm year observations, so every single row is a firm in a given year. The overall population we're interested in is firms which appeared on the index, so we don't count firms when they drop off. So we end up with 596 firms in total from 2007 to 2017, and the exact number varies by venue and indicator. The main dependent variable is firm year counts of appearances at each venue, so how many times did a given firm come to a given venue in a given year. And the key independent variables are these environmental, social and governance scores from Thomson Reuters, which are indicators of CSR. The ESG score is based on the company's CSR initiatives, and the combined score takes into account kind of controversies that have been reported about the company in relation to CSR topics. These are descriptive graphs showing the average number of times the top 10 to 12 firms appeared at each venue. So on the left we have Holyrood, and you see that it's mostly related to kind of utilities and public service delivery, and that companies headquartered in Scotland are quite well represented there. So you have SSE, by far the highest number of appearances. At Westminster you have a much larger number of appearances overall, so the firms that appear most often appear more often than they do in Scotland, and it's quite a varied selection there. So you have quite a mixture of firms. Here we have the same information for business department, ministerial meetings and hospitality. So on the right you'll see that the ministers are kind of wining and dining more media companies. Obviously the Daily Mail comes several times a year to the business department to have a drink or dinner with ministers. It's important for Conservative governments to maintain a good relationship with that newspaper. And for the meetings, there's obviously a much higher number. We'll have 4 companies here averaging more than 10 meetings per year, which is quite something. And here we tend to see more representation of kind of finance firms, which perhaps reflects the nature of the department. Here we've got Westminster committee appearances by each firm that appeared at least once in a given year. And the interesting thing about this is that you can see scandals in real time. So 2011-2012 you have the Barclays LIBOR scandal. In 2014 you can see G4S and Circle getting pulled up for a criminal tagging scandal, and even in 2012-13 kind of time you can see companies from the retail industry getting pulled in for the horse meat scandal. So what this kind of illustrates is there is a significant amount of sensitivity to events among these Westminster committee appearances. This plot basically shows the bivariate relationship between the ESG corporate social responsibility indicators and the dependent variable in the form of the mean number of committee appearances per year by firm. So this is basically just a scatter plot that's been labelled. When the observations are at the right, that's the ESG score, which is basically just based on the company's CSR initiatives. And when they move to the left, or when some of them move to the left, that shows the combined score, which is basically the company's ESG score, but weighted by another variable that takes into account kind of CSR related controversies. So in some ways it's kind of taking into account how much they actually walk the walk compared to the talk. And we see that the shape of the kind of bivariate relationship changes quite a bit once we take that into account. We have the same thing here for the ministerial meetings, and you see a very similar kind of dynamic going on, and also at Holyrood, and I think this just illustrates how few companies actually appear from the FTSE 350 at Holyrood. Most of the appearances were by kind of smaller local businesses. Just a very brief note on the modelling strategy. We follow Werner's empirical strategy here. Normal Poisson count models aren't really appropriate for this question due to the large number of zeros, but negative binomial models that would normally be used for zero inflated dependent variables assume that the zeros have no chance of the event occurring, and that counts are kind of initiated by a separate intervening variable, which is just not the case here. So we fit GEE models, which are a kind of special case of GLM with negative binomial family and link function and autoregressive correlation structure, just to account for the kind of repeated panel observations. Here we just have histograms of the main dependent variables. So Westminster committee appearances, Holyrood committee appearances, business department meetings and hospitality. And you can see the kind of issue here with the distributions, a huge number of zeros. Unfortunately, the counts at Holyrood, there are just too many zeros relative to the number of appearances, so the models basically don't work. But it's doable for the Westminster committees and the business meetings, which you'll see has a much longer right tail. So some firms came along to that more than 20 times in a given year. So here we have predicted margins from the main models. On the left we have the relationship between the normal ESG score and the number of invitations to Westminster committees in a given year, and on the right we have the same but for the combined score, which takes into account controversies. So on the left we kind of find the relationship that we hypothesised in hypothesis 1, although we have obviously the massive caveat that the model is not complete yet. There's still a lot of kind of transformation and combining of data to do before we have all the kind of controls that we're interested in. But this gives us a kind of early indication that we might be onto something. And on the right, this relationship's obviously a bit weaker, but it's interesting that once you take controversies into account, the relationship essentially flips around to become negative. So what this reflects, I think, is that we haven't got any control yet for hostile invitations to committees. So that's something we'll need to think about. But it at least shows that they're responsive to kind of, CSR related events. And here we have more predicted margins, this time from Poisson models where the zeros were removed. So this basically shows what makes it more likely for a firm that was invited at least once in a given year to be invited more times. So we kind of find a similar story. So the higher the ESG score, the more invitations you'll get. And this relationship's even stronger actually at the business department, which kind of speaks against our second hypothesis. and then once you take into account the controversies, the relationship's reversed. And this is something that was a bit of a surprise in the context of the business department. But again, this just speaks to the need to kind of finish the models and make them as robust as possible. So just a few takeaways before we finish. In relation to the first hypothesis, we have some provisional evidence to suggest this is the case, but the findings from the combined score variable suggest that we need much more comprehensive modelling, which we already knew. For the second hypothesis, the picture is very, very mixed, but it does seem to be the case that committee invitations are more likely to occur in response to controversies, although we do kind of have question marks over that. And finally, it basically was impossible to investigate the third hypothesis because we simply don't have enough observations on the dependent variable for the Scottish Parliament. Okay, thanks very much for watching. Here are my contact details. I hope you'll come along and follow me on Twitter, and I look forward to seeing everyone else's presentations. Cheers.